This video captures a presentation that the Creative Toolkit team gave in Slovenia at the Deagency conference in 2025, and it looks at the results of a small-scale research project looking at the artwork that was contributed to an online exhibit called Creative Remembrance. Here you can see a plan for the presentation, so we'll provide a little bit of background about art in medical contexts and in palliative care particularly, and I'll talk a little bit about the Creative Toolkit initiative and where it came from. Then I'll think more specifically about this actual data set that's presented here in this presentation and thinking about the exhibition and the Creative Remembrance project particularly. And finally, I'll culminate in thinking about what do we make of all of this? What can we use this for? How can we understand art and palliative care differently thanks to this work? So we just wanted to quickly introduce ourselves, the Creative Toolkit team. Obviously you can see me there on the screen. I'm Dr. Caitlin Kite. I'm a lecturer in the School of Education at the University of Exeter. And this work was undertaken by me in partnership with my colleague, Dr. Marie Clancy, who was also affiliated with the University of Exeter, but also with the University of Plymouth. To understand the Creative Toolkit work, you have to think more broadly about how creativity and art intersect with healthcare. And here in the West, at least, this is not something that really has happened all that much. Historically, we've kind of kept art and medicine separate, but increasingly we are finding that art is being brought into a medical context to help patients express themselves, to help doctors understand patients, to work through mental and psychological issues, to help families as they are grieving or going through a difficult time with a patient, and so on. And in fact, we are now not just seeing this in healthcare in general, but specifically within the context of palliative care. This is becoming more and more prominent. And when you look at the literature, we find that in particular, we see lots of work focusing on helping the patients and helping patients' families and thinking about the emotional difficulties, sort of an art therapy approach, which is really focusing on the psychology of the experience. And kind of left out of this, at least until more recently, is the healthcare staff themselves. But in fact, we find that it's not just the patients and the families that need an opportunity to think and to work through difficult things and to express themselves. It's also the carers. And this can be for a variety of reasons. It might be because they're feeling burnt out. It might be because they're processing something difficult and they need to understand what it is. It might be simply because art and creativity are just nice things to pursue, and that gives you a chance to reset a little bit and feel a bit more restored so that you have more energy to then put into your job. So increasingly, we are seeing that this kind of broad shift in healthcare to thinking about creativity and how it can be used is trickling down into palliative care and little by little trickling down to the support of staff as well, although that's still rather kind of early on in its early stages, and that was really what we wanted to focus on. In particular, we were interested in this issue and the support of staff because we work at an institution that has an academy of nursing, and so we do have nurses and also young doctors in the medical school that we know would go into clinical settings and feel that it's very challenging. There's a lot to process, and so we wanted to support them as they're making this shift and thinking about working in that profession and how to deal with all the very heavy things that come up. And as we were having these conversations with collaborators in the clinical space, we found out that actually a lot of the staff there were feeling just as overwhelmed. And this, of course, is something that we know globally is an issue. There is burnout in the healthcare staff. COVID-19 only exacerbated that. And so we had this idea that actually we needed to expand and not just think about how do we help our students to move into these spaces and to deal with those professional burdens, but actually how can we help everyone? And so we did start a partnership up with Hospice Care, which is a local palliative care center. And we have been co-creating with them individual activities, but also kind of larger schemes and interventions that we can use to help people find out about creativity and think about how they can be creative and what creativity can do in their everyday lives in terms of giving them a chance to reset, helping them to communicate with each other, helping even with efficiency and with learning and development, but also thinking about that emotional side of things, the reflection, having supervisory conversations, and so on. So we've looked at a wide range of things, and we've just been thinking about how can we use these different creative interventions to help this particular group of staff, these people in particular who are working in palliative care, in the hospice care organization specifically. And if we can nail it with them, can we roll this out to other staff as well? Because palliative care is kind of one of the hardest places to be. And so if this works for them, who else could it help, and how? So this is the nature of the Creative Toolkit initiative, and this is the context in which we were then able to explore this Creative Remembrance exhibition. In the work that we do with hospice care and other clinical staff, we tend to go in with some ideas in mind, some activities we want to run, some prompts that will help with dialogue, and we work with the staff to create something bespoke that will work for them given their particular needs. So if we have a sense of what are the activities that would work better for certain people or people working with certain issues, what are the prompts that would help, not just the mediums, but also what are the questions we could ask, what are the settings in which we do this, all of those aspects around the kind of wider curriculum and pedagogy of this. Having any knowledge that could inform that would help us to be more useful, more targeted, more efficient, more productive in these sessions. And I don't want to boil down well-being and development to efficiency and productivity, but it is quite difficult to get funding for these initiatives, and we do need to show that taking staff time out to work with arts and craft techniques, for example, is actually something that is supporting them in the end. So if we are able to really tailor this to be more useful and gather some data on that, then that allows us to really make sure that we can get some funding, get the time, get the resources to continue these sorts of initiatives. So this was the context in which we then thought, well, how could we look at this work differently, and how could we ask different questions that might give us other insights about how we do actually tailor that, and what questions, what activities would be more helpful. And the Deagency project, the context in which we created this research project and did this presentation, allowed us an opportunity to do that, because the Deagency initiative thinks about what is the agency of the dead. And we had a really lovely exhibit, which I'll talk about in a moment, where we had seen the pieces of art collected that people have made that represent their encounters and their experiences with death and dying and the dead. And so we were able to think, okay, what is the agency of the dead? How can we see that in these images? And what does that tell us then about what people are processing, what they're carrying around when they come into our sessions, what they need to get out of their system, the things that are lingering and maybe weighing them down. And if we know more about that, how does that allow us to tailor our work a little bit more, a little bit better, so that it is more effective? So this is the point at which we decided to revisit this selection of artwork that we already had so that we could look at it in a different way. And I'll describe to you now how we did that. The first thing to know is that we were able to take advantage of an exhibition that had already taken place and in which we had already gathered these pieces. And this was really helpful. This was something that we had organized globally so that we could engage with colleagues in palliative care in other countries, particularly in Australia, but also further afield. And we held this online series of talks in which we discussed creativity and creative interventions and the sorts of different practices that people had in different places. So we were able to exchange information in that way. And then people who participated or people who were interested in this area were able to then contribute pieces that they'd made, some of which were inspired by our conversations and by the methods that we had described, and others of which had just been done in their free time. So they contributed all of these to an online exhibition called Rest and Release. And then we also had later that year an in-person workshop, and this was a part of a festival of social sciences here in the UK, where we were able to show all of those pieces virtually. We broadcast them up on a wall in a really large exhibition space, but then we also had more materials in that facility so that anyone who came and saw those pieces could be inspired by that and then make their own work as well. And so they contributed some additional pieces. So between these two things, we had this lovely selection of artwork from people who were who are death doulas, nurses, families caring for their own loved ones. We even had some patients themselves. So we had quite a range of people who were approaching palliative care, hospice care, just caring in general and end of life in general from very different perspectives. And I just quickly want to say a little bit about the online exhibition itself, because you have a QR code. You're very welcome to go have a look at it and walk your way through in time when you have more time to actually look at each piece and read the information. But just to give you a sense of it, we had 37 different pieces that were contributed by 26 different people. And of course, because everything was in this virtual gallery, it had to be somehow communicable through an image or some text, but some of the pieces were actually in different media. They were sculpture, for example, that someone took a picture of, or they were crochet that someone photographed. So we did have many different types of medium. It wasn't just, digital work or painting. And in the next few slides, I'm just going to walk you briefly through the online exhibit yourself in case you don't have a chance to go, but so you have a sense of the look and feel of the collection. So here you can see the landing page, which is where the QR code will take you if you follow that from the last slide, and you can enter the exhibition by clicking on the black button. Once you're inside, you are able to walk through this room. As you can see, there are kind of two main rooms, the one that we're sort of in right now, and then if you go down that hallway, there's another one on the other side, and you can see the pieces hanging on the wall. So here's the second room that is further in front of that past slide, and you can see that it's a very nice sort of Zen-like space, very green outside, and it does give you the real sense of sort of walking through, and it allows you to take your time and look at each image alone, but also in this wider context and the selection of everything together. So here's looking back at that first room that we were in, and you can see from this picture here that there are these different media. So there's a drawing here just to the right. You can see some paintings on the left. At the far wall, you can tell, probably even though it's very small, that we had things in writing. So there were some poems that people contributed, some photographs there in the center. So many different media that were part of the exhibit. Now here's something that we'll come back to in a little bit, these two pieces, the one on the left in particular, but these are two contributions from someone who actually was a palliative care patient at the time of the exhibit. And you can see that as you approach a piece, you can sort of zoom in and get a bit closer. And then as we'll see on the next slide, you're also able to click the information tab there, which you see at the top right, so that you can read what each of the contributors has said about their piece. So here you can see I have clicked it, and you are able to see the information that has been provided by, in this case, the carer of this patient, but she provided information to the carer, and they provide a little bit of information about who they are, what they were trying to convey, and so on. So that gets us to the methodology and how do we actually analyze this work. So everyone that contributed a piece, they were very aware. They said yes to contributing it to an exhibition. At the time that they did that, they weren't aware that there would be this opportunity to analyze everything. So we reached back out to everyone and said, is it okay to include your piece in this work? And we only included pieces for those who said yes. And in that collection, we then looked through everything and found which pieces were eligible and which weren't. So in the context of the Deagency project, we were thinking specifically, what is the agency of the dead? And some of these pieces, particularly the ones that had been submitted through that first rest and release project, they weren't exactly all on the topic, because some of them were thinking a bit more generally about what is nursing like, what is it like to care. And it wasn't necessarily thinking about a palliative care setting specifically or about dying. And so those didn't really give us any information about the agency of the dead. So we weeded out the things that weren't really eligible, and that then left us with this subset of 14 pieces from 12 contributors who had kind of different positions, different perspectives on death, and they were also from different places. And in the literature, people are increasingly moving away from actually analyzing the the artistic piece itself, because so much of that is subjective. And so I could come in and say that certain colors mean something, certain images mean something, but other people might think very differently. So we didn't want to misrepresent and assume anything. And instead, we relied on the commentaries that were provided alongside the pieces. So one of which you saw a couple slides ago. So that's what we used to look for what people were saying about what is being captured and why that thing and how it's being captured. So everyone had slightly different summaries, and we extracted from those what information we could. So there are two kind of sets of results that we have to share. The first is when we looked at each piece individually and saw what themes were there, we could then look across and find recurring themes. And there are three of those that I think they are kind of intermingled, but they are also pretty distinct. But on top of that, if we stood back and kind of looked at the whole thing, there are also some interesting themes just across the exhibition. So first I'll start by looking at the narrow results, and then I'll broaden out and look at the more general results. So the first of our three themes from looking at the individual pieces can be captured really well here by the two pieces that you see on the screen. And these were both created by Nikki Ruddick, who was creating this artwork after her father-in-law died. And she actually created a whole series of things and only sent us two of those for the exhibition. And these exemplify really nicely something that came up so often with lots of people, where they are just feeling this hole in their life where someone had been there and now they're not. And so they're just thinking about, what does that feel like? They're trying to find metaphors for that sensation. So the feeling of drowning, of being kind of underwater, of all of these emotions being seen as an ocean. So that feeling of the kind of gap. And other people as well were thinking about, the kind of physical sensations of that, the emotional sensations, the kind of physicality in a space where you had someone next to you and now they're not there. So just lots of different ways to be thinking about what is it like now that someone is no longer around. And here we've come back to the piece that I showed you earlier from Carolyn Fitzpatrick. You can see that on the left. And actually Carolyn's carer, while she was in hospice care, is Bonita Ralph. And you can see a piece that's a collaboration between Bonita and her friend, who was a textile artist. And the two of them together made this life shroud. And Bonita works as a death doula as well as being a carer. And she is really interested in normalizing death and making it less scary for people by making it just more part of life. So they created the shroud with that intention, and she takes it to outreach events. She has it decorating her house. It's just there in her living room. And both of these two examples, while being quite different, really show you this theme that was also coming up quite frequently in a lot of the pieces and their accompanying summaries, which was just embracing mortality. And if not necessarily embracing it all the time in a positive way, at least coming to terms with it and saying, yes, we are all mortal. We only have so much time. So Carolyn made these, again, she also had a series, but she made the two pieces that she contributed while she was undergoing hospice care and while she was actively dying. She was an artist, a professional artist in life, and she kept doing that work while she was dying because it helped her to come to grips with what was happening and to document that for herself and for the people that were left behind. So these are two very different examples of people using this creative practice to think about the fact that, we are mortal and life is finite. And finally, a third theme is, I think, very closely connected to that last one, which is acknowledging, okay, if we are only here for a limited period of time, how do we make the most of it? So it's sort of thinking about how do we find meaning given this restricted time scale, but also how do we find meaning in a person's passing? So these are kind of separate things, but sometimes, they happen at the same time. They're coming together. And for many people, this act of death does help them to find purpose, or it helps them to think about their own purpose differently because they're suddenly engaging with this idea of being mortal and then thinking, okay, well, what am I here to do then? Or what can I do? And often this is a very transformative practice and transformative process for them because suddenly this is a really extreme awakening that they have had. So following on from that understanding of the mortality is this kind of like, right, I'm going to grab life and make something of it. And you can see two very different examples of this. So one of these pieces I selected as my own, not because I think I'm an amazing artist, but because it's one piece where I definitely know what the intention was. So I can feel pretty safe interpreting it. So you can see that's the piece on the right, where it uses this idea of metamorphosis to think about what happens when someone is dying, and what that causes to happen in your own life, that you metamorphose from the before when they're there with you to this after, and often that does make you to think about what they did and what legacy they've left and what that means for the legacy that you want to leave as well. And on the left, you can see a really excellent piece. This is one of my favorite pieces in the whole exhibit by Domini, who is a local healthcare provider. And she has created this piece actually with her children. So she's got a poem as well as the visual, which is what she did with her children, that is thinking about, how do people find meaning and how do they kind of rebuild after they have gone through this horrific experience of loss. So if you look across all of the different pieces in the collection, kind of as an ensemble, one thing that was really clear is that there is a lot of focus on the effect of the dead, of, I am feeling this loss now that they're gone. I'm feeling very sad. I'm really struggling. The family feels empty without them, and so on and so forth. But all of that is thinking about this effect that the death has had. And it doesn't really see the dead themselves. And where the dead are shown, we really don't see them as being dead. We don't see a corpse. We don't see decay. We don't see an urn with ashes in it, and so on. So it's a really interesting pattern, because if you look at kind of professional artwork, especially historically over time, we see some really gruesome things. We see some really vivid and very au naturel representations of death. But that's not really how we look at death now. And so we kind of turn away from that, and we work through death by different sorts of imagery and by different sorts of understanding. So we are very aware that someone has died, that a death has taken place, that something now is happening to their body that's quite different, but we really kind of move away from that biological grounding of that, and we're thinking about it in a very different sort of way, which is quite interesting. Of course, when we're thinking about how sad we feel when someone's not around, we probably aren't obsessing over kind of the biological process of death and what happens once the body is taken care of. And yet, in the past, that is something that was much more prominent if you look at some of the imagery. So it's interesting to compare how we are thinking about it and visioning it now, as opposed to how that maybe had happened in the past if you look through kind of similar selections of artwork. So now I'm just going to give a little bit more of a discussion about what we think we can make of all of this. I think the results that I gave, and again, acknowledging it's a relatively small sample size, so there's only so much of a conclusion that you can draw, you can rephrase each of those findings to more specifically address that question of, okay, what is the agency of the dead? So clearly, the dead are forcing us to renegotiate who are we now that they're gone. Now that my husband or father or mother or sister is gone, who am I? Do I still have the role that I had in life now that they're not here to help me define that? How do I keep going? How do I feel now that I feel differently? What do I do now that all of this has happened? Does it need to change? So it's creating this sense of our needing to renegotiate who we are and how we understand ourselves. All of this process is something that can actually be quite useful in many ways and quite educational. And so these last 2 points really go together, that the dead are helping us to engage with this idea that we aren't going to be here forever, that we will also be dead one day. And through doing that, they're also kind of teaching us often. When someone dies, we do often ask, what did they regret? They might tell us what they regretted. What do we admire in their life that they lived? And how does that teach us about how we can live a good life. So not only are we engaging with the idea of mortality, but we're maybe thinking, well, how do we make the best of that? And watching them go through this process of death and dying is helping us to do that. So there is this agency of the dead, and that they are giving us this message, they're giving us this opportunity and kind of forcing us to engage with that more than we might perhaps on a daily basis. And you can see from the quotations here on the screen and in some of the past slides that these are things that we see mentioned in the literature as well, where people have used art in the context of kind of healthcare and generally, but also palliative care specifically. So some of what we are finding here is in keeping with what we have seen elsewhere when art is brought in to support patients, loved ones, even some carers as well. One of the things that this made us wonder about is how we could use this sort of art as a means of supporting death literacy and normalizing death, really. We know that, as I've mentioned earlier, the way that we think about death and dying now are very different than in the past. We are an increasingly secular society. We have kind of outsourced the care of the dying and the care of the dead to professionals. We don't do it ourselves. It's not in our homes for the most part. And so we're very separate from all of this, and we're very hygienic about it, and it's not there in front of us so much in the way that it used to be. So people have gotten increasingly uncomfortable. You know, this is happening also in a world where we are not hunting our own food. Most of us aren't growing our own food or killing the animals that we would eat. And so just in general, we aren't really as plugged in with these natural cycles as we used to be. So death is very scary for a lot of people because it is so unknown and so distant. And this even includes healthcare professionals, not because they don't know or feel comfortable about death, but because they know that other people will feel uncomfortable about it. And often the way that they think about it, the way that they engage with it is quite blunt and very practical, and they know that that can make people uncomfortable. So it makes it very difficult for them to have honest conversations, sometimes with each other, but more often with patients, with families, and so on. So we were wondering, to what extent can you take pieces like this and make them available to the public? How do you bring the public in? How do you make that palatable enough that they will even want to engage? But how could that be used to kind of show this is what it's like, this is what it's going to be like? How could you give people prompts to help them to try to imagine it in advance so that they could sort of anticipate and then make it a little bit less scary when it actually happens? And how might that also help everyone to think about different perspectives on death? Because now we have this increasingly international and global society where we have people with different religions and different cultures who have very different practices around death. So how could pieces like this help us to educate about these different views and these different ways of being and ways of engaging? So all of this really made us think about how creativity is not just useful for helping people to express these ideas and work through these difficult emotions and get things off their chest. Yes, it's very therapeutic, but also it could be extremely helpful as a starting point for some really important conversations and maybe changing the culture a little bit and allowing us to have a bit more death literacy. And that is a really nice way as well of potentially giving back some agency to the dead. So it's no longer the case that people die and then we kind of bustle off their bodies and then we have to move on and go through these very kind of rigorous practices of going to the funeral home and going to the crematorium and things like this that are just, they're very regimented. But how can we make that a little bit more organic, a little bit more human, a little bit more holistic, so that we can reintegrate this with our lives, perhaps? Now, all of that's kind of a big vision for the future. More specifically to us and thinking about the work that we are already doing with people in palliative care and clinical settings, thinking about this from the perspective of, the pieces that are being made and what's being expressed in that and where we hear the voices of the dead. Yes, we have now realized that actually maybe there are some different prompts that we could give. Maybe there are some different activities so that we help people to think about not just their own experiences or the experiences of the families or the patients, but also of the dead themselves, and not just what we're feeling now, but what will be coming, and how do we create maybe a smoother transition. So there are many different things that we could do in the work that we're already undertaking that would allow us to shift the perspective a little bit with these slight adjustments, and maybe use the creative mechanisms to achieve slightly different goals that could, I don't want to say make death easier, because it's never going to be easy, but take certain barriers away and make certain conversations and certain feelings a little bit more fluid, perhaps, and a little bit less difficult. We are interested in continuing to add pieces to the exhibition as people continue to work with these activities and share with us what they've done. And if we were to do that, if we were to grow our exhibit and look at these different pieces through a similar lens, would we keep seeing the same patterns? Would we have maybe new themes emerge? Would it change our understanding? So we realize this is a relatively small sample size, and we would like to grow it. And that does include as well growing it to include pieces from folks outside. We already have people outside the UK, but also outside kind of Western, global Northern type of cultures. We're also really interested in just thinking about how do we bring in different sorts of participants as well, not just in terms of kind of culturally and ethnically, but also thinking about the different folks who could be engaging with these techniques. So primarily we've been working with staff, but can we work more with patients and their families? This would be quite a blunt thing to do with them, but maybe that would help some people. What if we were to work with folks in different types of support kind of roles? So people in art therapy, people who are chaplains, people who are teachers. So there might be all sorts of different people that we could engage with and use these mechanisms, who would then use the knowledge and the techniques in their own practice in different ways. And in fact, we're initiating a project this autumn with Hospice Care, where they're revamping their chapel space to be a little bit more multicultural. So it's more of a sanctuary for anyone of any spirituality or even no spirituality. And that's a really great space in which we can start thinking maybe about some of these issues. So regardless of your culture or your beliefs, you will encounter death, and how can we create a space in which everyone has a place to feel comfortable thinking about death, but also has a way to engage with these ideas that's not dependent on particular belief systems. So we do have some ideas for where we might take this next, but we're also really interested to hear from other people about, how do these ideas resonate with you? How would this fit in your practice? What would this look like in your context? And just before closing, as a little extra, I just wanted to give a taster of the sort of thing that we do, because I think a lot of people hear us talk about Creative Toolkit in palliative care and think, well, that's a bit weird, art and dying, that seems a bit serious and you're being a bit silly about it. So let me just walk you through one example and give you a sense of the sort of thing we might do with palliative care staff. So my colleague Marie is particularly interested in poetry. She's written a lot of poetry as a nurse and as an educator to help her think about difficult things and to help other people communicate what they are thinking and come into touch with what they're thinking. So one of the ways that she loves to do that is to start with kennings. Kennings are relatively simple. This comes from a Viking tradition of using these short metaphorical phrases to help express ideas in sort of a cloaked way. And there are lots of ideas about where that came from. Were they trying to be secretive? Was it just, considered very poetic and artistic? We don't really know at this stage, but it is a really lovely thing that you can see in traditional texts if you look at Beowulf, for example. And kennings are just a couple of words. It's just kind of like a riddle where you're using two nouns or a noun and an adjective. Sometimes they're slightly longer, like a whole phrase, but they're creating a metaphor, like whale road would be used to explain the ocean or to describe the ocean. So you could write kennings to help you think about the sorts of terms that we see here on the screen in different ways. And if you think about them in different ways, how might that affect how they make you feel, or how you engage with these ideas in your practice, or how you talk about these things with a patient or a colleague. So, for example, if you were to write a kenning about death, how might you describe death? Something like world ender, or long sleep, for example. And one of those sounds a little bit more catastrophic than the other one. It's a little bit gentler. What does that mean about how you perceive death or about how someone else might see it? So that's something that you could begin to work with as an example, to just start to dip your toe into some creative ways or creative things you could bring into this context. Kind of building on that, not entirely different, because metaphor often comes up in creativity. It's working with metaphors visually and words and so on. It's just a really great way to be creative. So you could actually do that kenning exercise here, or you could adapt it if you wanted to, or you could do what I'm about to describe. So this is something that was created in collaboration with a particular of our colleagues in hospice care, and she likes to use something like this in the context of her supervisions that she has with staff, where they're working through these problematic encounters and difficult things. So she likes to say, okay, think about whatever it is that's bothering you, whatever it is that's on your mind, think about that and summarize it in one sentence. And then she leads them through kind of a rapid fire exercise of, okay, if it were a type of weather, furniture, food, and so on, what would that experience be? So having to think kind of instinctively and quickly, just boom, 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 respond. So that's something that you could do specifically through the frame of death or dying or mourning or whatever word you wanted to substitute in. So you could say, summarize your experience with death in one sentence. Now, if that experience was one of the following, what would it be? If it were weather, what would it look like? If it were furniture, what type of piece would it be? If it were a food, what would it be? What would it taste like? So you get to the end of that list and you say, okay, review what you've written. Some of those will have landed with you and they will really have resonated and be useful. Others, not so much. So highlight or circle or whatever the ones that you actually think, yeah, there's something in that. I can get something from thinking about that. And then think about why is that helpful and how does that help you to kind of see the situation differently and maybe even begin to process that or come up with a solution or a response, whatever it is that you need. So this could be something that you then allow someone to do in writing, or maybe they do it with you verbally. Maybe you just do this on your own. But then you've got this process of using that creative approach to work through something and think about something and maybe come at it from a slightly different angle and change your thinking as a result. So this is the sort of thing that we might be doing with people in our sessions. I know when we say creativity, it sounds like we just mean we're going to be painting, drawing, lots of things, but actually we try to do something that's a little bit more targeted. And nothing wrong with painting or drawing, I do both, but these are things that maybe are a little bit more efficient at helping you to specifically think about certain things and do something with that and not just kind of distract yourself from these difficult feelings. So here quickly is a list of our references and resources. You can come back to this. We'll have the slides accompanying this video so you're able to see those. I know they're quite small, so you can actually look at the PDF if that's a little bit more useful. And finally, thank you very much. I realize this has been a long presentation for a time when we often don't watch very long videos. So thank you very much if you've stuck with us. And you can see here the QR codes for our website and also for the online visit if you want to go directly to it. I've also just put the URL there if that's a little bit easier for you. So hopefully you found this research interesting. We would love to keep the conversation going. We would love to collaborate. We would love to have more pieces in the exhibit. So if you want to have a chat, please do reach out.